And today we will play with the principle of body level phrasing. Now, what does that mean? So, I will be speaking about and facilitating where movement initiates from and where it travels and how it travels. So in a general sense, we're dealing more with the kind of inner space of the body. We've spoken in other sessions about kinesphere and general space and different pathways in the kinesphere. And today I'm kind of thinking more around the inner experience of the body and the initiations and the articulations. And why would we look at this is the next question to answer. Like, why is this useful in any way? So in our general moving around in the world, we have particular patterns of phrasing of our movement, where it starts from how we connect to our base of support, how we shift weight, how we orient ourselves. And this work is very much about getting to know the particular habits and patterns that you might already have in phrasing your movement. And then by choosing some different ways of organizing it, realizing that there are more options, and also recognizing that you maybe have habitual ones that are maybe easier or more familiar. And here we get to kind of repattern some of those or come into a greater awareness of the patterns that we already use and hopefully expand that. So there might be moments where it feels a bit uncomfortable or a bit weird, and that's totally fine and very normal, because you will be kind of interrupting some more habitual ways of moving. She says, moving like this constantly, simultaneously from my hands, over and over again, repeated this phrasing. So you will have all these habits and patterns in your everyday movement, but then also in your dancing or your singing or in other kinds of practices that you already do. There's a few different ways we can talk about this in terms of initiation and sequencing, and there's a few quite specific terms that I will use. And then we can get to some more kind of general ideas of phrasing through the body as well, using the developmental pattern support. But the three we'll start with, or we'll kind of visit quite specifically and then quite kind of in a more playful way, let's say, are simultaneous. So simultaneous sequencing is the firing of several joints at once. So things are happening together. It might be all the joints of the body, or it might just be several of them, but there's a simultaneity about how they are activating and moving together. So simultaneous sequencing. It's a very alliterative class. All the words begin with S, so just bear with me with this. So another pattern of phrasing is sequential sequencing, which means that things are happening in an order. That doesn't necessarily mean it's happening through anatomical order. And what do I mean by anatomical order? I mean literally the connection of the tendons, of the fascia, of the muscles, of this continuity of, we can call the arm. So simultaneous might mean the whole arm moving together. Sequential means that I'm going to move things in an order, but it's not necessarily passing through anatomical connection each time. If I really want to make a point about moving through anatomical order, I will call this successive sequential sequencing. So I might go shoulder, elbow, wrist, finger. So we've got a sense of continuity through the inner landscape of the body, of the tissues of the bones. I mean, for this work, I'm dealing mostly with the idea of initiating at the level of joints between where two bones meet. But body level phrasing could equally be through another body system. We could think of initiating from the skin or from the eyeballs or from another kind of body system. But we'll play with these three specifically, and then we'll go into some more upper lower body half stuff. All right, that's enough theoretical overview. Please take yourself into your space, have a little travel. If you're lying on the ground already, feel free to stay there, and your traveling could be rolling. So something in your space to get things moving. That might be crawling, it might be rolling, it might be walking, depending on the amount of space you have. And beginning to connect to your sense of weight, your sense of flow, sense of breath, coming into how you feel in this particular moment. Taking these first few moments of class to connect, to arrive, to notice the level of energy in your body. Maybe a little bit about the space you're in again, what you see around you. Getting used to the amount of room that you'll have to move in. And if you've been walking, maybe roll. If you've been rolling, maybe crawl. If you've been crawling, choose something else. And doing what you need to do to connect to your weight. That might be a little pulsing, or a little rocking, or a little shaking. You might want to take some slightly deeper breaths. Sensing the three-dimensionality of your body. And so, generally in somatic movement practices, there is a preference for successive sequential sequencing. So the idea of the movement through the parts of the body being sensed, being visible, being somehow a clearer participation in your experience. And so maybe right now that's what's happening, as you allow the fluid contents of your body to pour, the weight to shift, information traveling through from base of support through into other structures. So one more minute of whatever you feel like it would help your body arrive, help you arrive. And let's come to sit. And we can find a kind of extended shape. It's a bit similar to the big X that we'll normally lie on the floor in. But let's find this closing of the limbs, really simple, condensing and expanding. And so I'm still using a lot of breath support to do this. I'm allowing my spine to curl, my feet and my hands and my head and my tail to condense towards my navel center, and I can expand away. It's really not about making like a massive, look how much flexibility I have kind of shape. It's more about finding this simultaneous activation through the distal ends of the body, through the hands and the feet, and the head and the tail, to come in and to come out. And then we can find that next time you find yourself in a little ball, you can bring yourself all the way to the floor. Hands can be behind you to support you. And we can carry on this condensing and expanding with a little roll to the side. And so all joints active. The feet and the ankles, the hands, the elbows, the shoulders, the hips, the spine. So instead of thinking of initiating at navel center or at the kneecaps, let's try and take in the whole of the body, activating to move. And some parts of you might be traveling further. Like one arm has to take more of a circle over the head to arrive, whereas the other one can just fold in. But despite the different lengths of the journey, a sense of equalness through the parts. And you can play with opening onto your front. And it's a little harder now to become simultaneous as you adjust, and one arm might extend and then the other arm might extend, and you're already starting to come into sequential phrasing or sequential sequencing. But let's stick up with simultaneous sequencing for a little bit longer. And play for yourself. It doesn't have to be these X's and O's anymore. It could be other kind of movement that feels like it's happening, everything together. And if that means adding a little pause, feel free to add a pause, or you can keep finding this ongoingness of everything moving, everything moving. And it might not necessarily be with condensing and expanding, but this is a useful way to organize the simultaneousness of the activation through the limbs and the spine. So the spine and the limbs, all equally active. And it might be with more moments of stillness to then reactivate everything, or it might be with more ongoingness, more gradual change, rather than more abrupt change of everything. And so here we find that changing the sequencing or the experience of this simultaneous action can also change your experience of the time, how it takes. And then just take a little pause and recuperate however you'd like to recuperate from that. And notice how you feel, having mobilized this sense of everything together, or as many things as possible together. You might have opinions about it. It might feel quite simple, or it might feel quite pleasurable, or it might feel quite boring. Like, that's totally fine. You can have opinions about all of this work. Okay. Let's find a heel rock. So bringing the legs to narrow, parallel, long legs, heels in line with your sitting bones, and take a little rock on the balls of the heels that travels through the legs, through into the spine, through into the skull. And so now we're finding an initiation at the level of the heel. And you might add a little knee bend in this to find more of a successive sequential flow up towards head and down towards tail. The heels are the thing that's steering this, and the rest of the body is coming along for the ride. And then let that go, take a little pause. Releasing the weight onto the ground. And so let's bring our attention a little bit further in still to tip of spine at the head and the tail. Can you find a little lateral jiggle starting at the tailbone that ripples through the spine sequentially through into the skull, and then a little ripple through the spine, sending this jiggle down to the tailbone. And so it might feel like you have to push a little bit through sacrum to make this happen. Trying to mobilize one vertebrae and the next above it, and the next above it, and the next above that, and the next above that, all the way through into the top of the skull, and then sending it back down again. And there may be parts of the spine where this successive sequential sequencing is not so clear and it jumps, or it stops. So playing a little with tail to head, and head to tail. And maybe you feel like there are still areas that need a bit more vibration or a bit more information, and go ahead and make a little soft fist with one hand and cup with the other hand. And if you knock your fist into your palm, you can find a rock through the forearms that travels into the shoulders, that travels into the rib cage and into the spine. And you might know this from Feldenkrais. It's pretty much me going, this is really nice, I will take this action and play with it in sequencing. So if I change where my hands are relative to my spine, that part of my spine can mobilize. If I take my hands really low down to my pelvis, I can get my tailbone a bit more mobile. And then if I slowly bring my hands up, I'm no longer initiating from my spine for the jiggle, but more finding this through rocking my arms to see what happens through the spine. My spine is more passive as my arms are more active. But maybe with more of a passive torso, I can find more mobilization through the joints. Especially those areas that didn't feel like they were able to mobilize when I was actively directing it. And so it's up to you when you pause, your hands above skull, in front of chest, around diaphragm. And this rock is trying to be as easy as possible. It's not super forceful. I'm trying to initiate more from my knuckles than through my shoulders, even though my shoulders are for sure involved. How can this be really as easy as possible without it becoming very bound and overly stable? It's got this casual feeling to it that hopefully shall increase the successive sequential potential. And then let the arms go and find that lateral jiggle through the spine again. Tail to skull and skull to tail, and see if things are a little bit more mobile there now. And there may still be places where it feels like the information jumps and you have to kind of muscle your way around it. That's fine. This is all experimentation, exploration. Great. And then go back to a heel rock and see how that feels now through your body. And again, if you'd like to find a little bend through the knees, that helps take the pressure off the lower back so you can find more rock through pelvis and torso. Go ahead and do that. And check that the skull is nodding rather than sliding on the floor. Okay, and then bring arms and legs a little wider again. And let's play with more of a successive, sequential flow of our X's and O's, and let's initiate now through the whole length of the spine. So spine is going to start head towards tail, tail towards head, and the limbs are going to follow. Allowing the spine to pour back onto the ground. And that can travel through the proximal joints of the shoulders and the hips into the arms and the legs. Bit of breath support here as you exhale and condense. Head and tail going towards each other, drawing the legs and arms with you. Spine leading, limbs following. Back to your back. So there is a sense of activating spine, limbs being passive until the information travels through, and then they can feel a little bit more active. Releasing them onto the ground, oscillating between this kind of passive weight and then activated fluid place. Spine leading, head and tail moving towards each other, so there's a bit of rotation happening as well as a condensing. So I can take it more through the kind of horizontal or through the sagittal. Or rather the vertical plane. And again, you can start to play with this successive sequential sequencing, opening onto your side, opening onto your front if you wish. Or taking that image of spine leading, limbs following into other kinds of movement. Finding a sequencing through the spine which is successive is one thing to think about, but we could also find the spine moving both ends together, head and tail active, and the rest of the vertebrae joining in. But the whole spine could be also a successive sequential sequence of its own. And that might bring you back into rolling of tail leading, and then the rest of the spine following, or the skull leading to roll you. So in your own way, playing some more with successive sequential sequencing with this focus on the spine. And the limbs might become more active. They might support you on the ground, or they might fold and slide. then if you're not lying on the ground again, come back to the lying on the ground and re-find a little heel rock as a kind of reminder of this specificity of the heels or of a particular bony landmark in the body initiating. And see how the sequencing feels through the rest of your body. And then take a little pause and recuperate however you would like to recuperate. That might mean rolling to your side, closing your eyes, hugging your knees into your chest. So recuperation being something different to what we were just doing doesn't necessarily mean resting, but it can. If you've been working with eyes closed for a while, it might be recuperative to open them. If you feel a bit nauseous from all this fluid folding, it could be useful to be still. Okay, so let's play with sequential sequencing, where we're no longer so interested in moving through anatomical order, which we'll come back to. But go ahead now and play with moving one part of the body, one joint, and then moving another joint, and then another joint. And you can give yourself the pause in between to pay attention to what's happening. So things are happening in an order and they're not really overlapping either. Something's coming to the end before something starts again. So in your own way, playing with movement happening in a sequence. And it might just be at the level of one joint, or it might be a couple of joints. And then going into something else. So there's something about kind of inhibiting the sequencing through your body, especially because we just really enlivened that now. So it's a bit putting the brakes on. And if moving incredibly slowly is becoming tedious, you can challenge yourself by moving a little quicker. But if you're enjoying the exploration of just one joint at a time, or one little phrase, and then another one, then another one, that's also possible. And if you want to play with the length of whatever activates, so that you're not so even, that's also, of course, fine. So as you're playing this strange game with yourself, try not to hold your breath. Can you still connect to your weight as you do this, and your flow, even though there is this inhibiting of the sequencing through your body after an initiation? And if you're needing a framework to put this into, go ahead and play with the X as an O pattern, rolling to one side and coming back into a big X. How can this be done with sequential sequencing, not in anatomical order? So you might take a knee, you might adjust your arm, you might bring your pelvis over, you might bring your arm over the top. what maybe felt like one phrase before now feels like 20. But you get to see where you might push from. So actions in an order, trying not to go through all the soft tissue connecting your parts together. And that might take you out of the ground, might roll you a little. And let's put this into a bit of another framework, we can call it. Come to the supine hook position. And we can play with, actually legs long, we can play with a pre-thigh lift and a return from pre-thigh lift. So what do we call this? Is it simultaneous sequencing because it's my hip, my knee, and my ankle? Could be. Is it successive sequential because I'm going to start at my navel center yielding and dragging the rest of my leg with it? Could I think of it as sequential sequencing? Breath, joints. Have a go yourself with this action of relating heel bone to sitting bone, shortening that distance between the two bones, and extending that length between the bones by condensing my one leg and extending. And what about the coordination of breath and my attention to the sequencing? And the next time you have one knee bent, let's go ahead and bend the other one and do thigh lift. So the action of exhaling, floating the thigh, inhaling in return, and that can be a passive inhale to return the thigh, or it could be an active directing of my heel back down to the ground. And it might feel like a sequence of exhaling, softening into back surface, action of the thigh coming up, a sense of condensing in the hip socket. Now for this next one, we'll put those together and make it more of an overlapping phrase, and it might be useful if you're on a more sticky floor to have socks on. Let's play with a rhythm that goes flex both knees, extend one, return the leg. So I'm returning from thigh lift and swapping my legs over to find pre-thigh lift and thigh lift. Hopefully you can see that. I've got a rhythm that goes as my foot hits the floor from the return of the thigh lift, my other leg extends, and then I swap them. And if I allow for a bit of successive sequencing, I can find the underlying support of my heel rock. have a rhythm now of extension and contraction. And if I slow it down, then it's slightly more heavy for me if I take it without the momentum. But it can be useful then to see what's going on in terms of the sequencing through to my spine, finding that nod of the skull. I'm allowing my pelvis to rock, to tip. Pelvic floor is pretty active in all of this. And then let your legs go, give them a shake. Okay. So let's come back to the big X position from that sense of overlapping phrasing in the legs. Let's continue this slight kind of expansion of the sequencing and re-find that head-tail connection to find a contraction to the side, and go ahead and find a flexion of the elbow and the knee at the same time to find this body half action. And just do one side and come back to the middle. So we have a simultaneity of the arm and the leg and the right side of the spine. And then allow it to condense so much so that you start to roll towards it, and then the other side, that left side, can come with you and rest on top. And then let's activate quite simultaneously the left arm and the left leg to extend. And to allow a roll across back of sacrum. And then to open the right side. So left side condenses and expands. Get that going first. And the head might slide on the ground, or it might turn to see the same hand as the knee. Or you might find the head turning to the opposite hand. So head and tail finding a journey towards each other through the side of your space. Simultaneous sequencing of hip and shoulder, elbow, knee, even wrist and ankle. So the proximal joints, the mid-limb and the distal ends all working together. Until eventually you can condense to the left so much so that you start to roll, and the right arm and right leg can get involved. And then extending through right side. And going right side, sequencing into left side. And for yourself in your own timing, finding right side into left side into right side. And you might find that when you're on your side in a small ball, the underneath side initiates to find a press and to find an extension of the top side. What do I mean by that? I'm finding the ground to find the support here rather than just the up side. So body half into body half, that might shift you over into a small ball, into a crouch. It might bring you out of the ground. It might bring you through the side space. So we played with this before if you've been to the developmental movement classes, this body half leading. And give yourself the chance here to phrase this through your body of one half into the other half. Right side into left side, including the spine. you feel like you're losing a sense of the simultaneity of the sides, you can always find yourself on your back again in that lateral condensing, or on your front. Also possible here to find that simultaneity of the side of your body, limbs and spine. You might use this to gradually find a way of coming from lying to sitting, or from really a low level to the ground to a different base of support. Rolling perhaps from one side to the other, pressing out of the ground. Or from one sitting bone to the other sitting bone. You might even find yourself back where we began in this big X. Rolling through one side, across the back, into the other side. Left side, into right side, into left side. Or you might find yourself coming on to 2 feet. Taking whatever movement you would like to take. And maybe sometimes a body half sequencing becomes more of a cross-lateral sequencing, where a limb takes over and travels through to the other limb of the opposite side. If that's too much of a leap, go ahead and find a little diagonal heel rock for yourself. If you're carrying on enjoying what you're finding, feel free to stay with that. So a diagonal X rock from one heel through to the opposite arm. And what that might mean for spiraling, bringing yourself in to sitting from lying, or from sitting to hands and foot on the floor. And so maybe your sequencing feels more successive sequential. Maybe there are moments where you give yourself a pause to reinitiate. And take a little moment to play with your connections of how all these parts fit together. We've mobilized quite a lot through limbs and spine. Limbs leading with spine, or spine leading, limbs following. And you might find yourself in something that you could repeat a few times. So you might end up giving yourself a little loop that you can repeat. The movement itself doesn't have to loop, but we've had quite a few repetitive patterns where there's been sort of no beginning, no ending feeling. So if you find yourself in one, use it as the site of inquiry to go, okay, what's my sequencing here? Is this simultaneous? Is this successive sequential sequencing? Is it body half to body half? And what would happen if I made it that sequencing? What would change in the movement itself if I changed the sequencing? What would happen if I tried to make what feels incredibly successive sequential into sequential without successive? What part of the movement would still stay? And what really has to change? And if you get fed up of that little phrase, move on, riding the impulse of however you feel you want to move, and then you might find another little deja vu, a little loop of movement that you could repeat to then get to know. Where is this starting? Where is it traveling through your body? And how are you riding those changes through your joints, through your soft tissue? So finding a little loop of repetition might give you more chance to sense into what's happening. How is it to change the phrasing of the movement, but you still keep some essence of what it was? And if you haven't found a third one, have a play with a third one. It might be a shift of weight, it might be a shift of level, it might be a rotation into something, out of something. Slowing down your perception a little bit to understand how you're doing this. Where is it traveling? Where it becomes more passive and comes along for the ride, or where really activates? How would it be to make it an entirely simultaneous event? Can also refer to this as the part leading. And maybe changing the phrasing changes your breath, changes the relationship to your body's weight, and how fluid you feel your body to be. And how maybe you can start to feel that wherever you set something in motion gives you information to carry on following it. So you don't need to necessarily start something else in sequential sequencing that really is leaping through anatomical order. Maybe something else takes over through anatomical order. Take one more minute of exploration. Of this real research into your ways of making the patterns of your movement. And then find yourself on your back. Take a little heel rock again. It's up to you whether you want to take the legs wide or take the legs narrow, whether you want to have your legs externally rotated or parallel or even internally rotated. Up to you. Also with heel rock, you can have your arms down by your sides with your palms on the ground, or you can have your arms up above your shoulders. And slow heel rock down. What is the slowest and smallest it can be? So that you can still feel this successive sequential sequencing from lower body through to upper body. From heels through tailbone, spine, into skull, even into hands. And then finding a moment of stillness. And eventually we'll meet back at the computer screens for a little chat. But don't feel like you have to rush to get up off the floor.